Recording in progress.
Okay, we're going to call this Governing Board study session to order. Our first discussion item is the strategic plan review.
And I believe Dr. Richmond is joining us virtually, and she will be providing us with an overview of the strategic planning, and we all should have the document in our agenda. Dr. Richmond?
Thank you, Chancellor. Chair Rial, members of the board, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today about strategic planning. I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a second. All right, good. Do you see a blue slide titled Strategic Planning coming through?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So what we're going to cover in the session today, I'm using my windows. Here we go. What we're going to talk about during the session, we have 30 minutes to talk about strategic planning, and I'm going to give you a brief update on the current strategic plan and then talk about a strategic planning process that's going to be in process this year and invite the input of the governing board. Specifically, I'll hit some of the key considerations within planning. That's really the primary area, and then inviting the board's comments on that piece. The current strategic plan was approved by the governing board back in spring 2021, and it runs through to June 30th of 2025. It was developed by the strategic planning team. This is a collaborative group. We use a stakeholder model per the planning model from the Society of College and University Planning, where we have representatives from the key areas of the institution, including students, and we have a faculty co-chair who runs the process along with myself. We use a mix of traditional planning methods, so a SWOT analysis, a competitor analysis, things like that, and futures techniques to identify key priorities for the institution. Community input is, of course, vital, and some of the channels involved in the development of the current plan were the Futures Conference event that we held in 2021, and also a survey. We had some open forums as well that community were also able to attend. Central within the plan that's in place is our Achieve 60 Pima County goals, which is, as I know you're all very familiar now, that by 2030, 60% of Pima County residents aged 25 to 64 will hold a post-secondary degree or credential. We have targets associated with that. One, an overall completed target when we look at every student at the institution, for which we look for a 65% increase over baseline. And then aligned with the statewide effort, we also have targets for 3 race ethnicity groups where we're looking to double the completed counts based on the inequities we see within the community that we serve. We talked relatively recently back in May about the status of the plan. I wanted to provide the update dashboards for year 1 and year 2 anyway, and listed are the various people and their teams who've been directly involved in these different projects. We continue to have a few pieces that still need to wrap up from year 1, but overall, when we look at all the tasks and all the progress, we're at about 90% completion for that year. The number is relatively similar for year 2. We have slightly more completed activities, but we have 2 which are slightly earlier in the process of being wrapped up at 50%. But we have plans in place to support the completion of each of these. So all of these projects from year 1 and 2 will be back on track and complete in the hopefully relatively near future. Within the plan, we have our priorities lined up, the strategic priorities for 23-24. I won't read through all of these. You can see them listed here. I will note, however, that one of the year 3 goals was implement auto-confer. That was switched with a different item. So we actually completed auto-confer in year 2, and the focus for year 3 is reverse transfer, which was originally planned for year 2. We just switched those 2 around. Both reside with the Office of the Registrar. Within the last year of the plan, 24-25, we have 2 items identified. One is related to learner payment structures, and the other is to do with the college-wide effectiveness process, which is kind of sprinkled throughout all of the years of the plan. Now, you'll notice this year is thin in terms of the priorities that were identified. And this was intentional because back when we developed the plan, we knew that 3 years is a really long time. The pace of change in the world is so fast. We didn't want to commit too much in year 4 because we knew we would want to revisit the plan and take a look and determine what the priorities need to be. This meant we would already have kind of like a mini planning process to look at the plan, see whether we needed to add new things in the last year, or whether we would focus any needed time to complete the items due earlier in the year. But with the transition in college leadership, we need to extend the plan. So we not only need to assess year 4, but we also need to extend the plan out by 1 year. And the reason for this is the CEO is an absolutely critical voice within the strategic planning process. And we'll see how the timeline plays out and the ability to identify a good, strong chancellor to lead the institution. But they certainly wouldn't be on board in time to be directly involved in the strategic planning process to create a new plan that came online in the middle of 25. So we're going to hold a strategic planning year this year, specifically to review and potentially propose changes to the year 4 priorities and to identify priorities for the 25-26 year. The revised plan is currently intended to run until June 30th of 2026. Now, whenever we develop a strategic plan, there are a number of key considerations. This is not a comprehensive list, but it's some of the main ones. We need to look at the mission of the institution. The planning always needs to start from the mission. We need to assess current year priorities, assess the college today, determine community needs, think about the future of the college. And for the discussion today, what I would like to invite is the governing board's input on the priorities you would like us to think about and keep in mind as we develop the strategic plan. I should note now, and I'll reiterate this later, the team that's formed to develop the plan will draft a recommended document that will come to the governing board for review and approval. So the strategic planning team is a recommending group. It is, of course, within the purview of the board to give final approval for the strategic plan. Just to elaborate slightly on some of these priority areas. So within the mission of the college, we have a number of key aspects of the institution that are highlighted and communicated: affordable education, open admissions, serving and meeting the needs of the diverse community that we serve, and the other items as listed here. These are all critically important, and they all spell out in either our purpose statement, vision, or mission. In terms of current year priorities, which we will be monitoring and thinking about as part of the planning process to see if there are required steps that need to come up in future years, we have the year 3 items within the strategic plan. We also, of course, have the year 1 and year 2 items that we're still wrapping up now. And we have the interim chancellor's goals as approved by the governing board last Wednesday. Strategic planning has to include a critical assessment of the college today. We cannot determine the route forward if we don't understand where we're at today as an institution. And this will involve a number of different steps, an analysis of access, progress, and outcomes data for diverse populations. These are routinely monitored, but this will be a specific point of discussion for the planning team. We need a full assessment of institutional effectiveness. And really related to that, we need to do a careful review of all of the recent learner and employee related surveys. And we may need to do some additional data gathering through other surveys to ensure we have a good understanding about the institution today. Space utilization, of course, is key. I'll touch on that again in a couple of minutes. And we need to hear from our learners, our employees, and the community. And I'll be happy to elaborate a little bit on some of the channels that we're considering for the upcoming planning year, so we can ensure we have good, strong avenues for input from each of these key stakeholder groups. Community needs, of course, are vital. I touched on those just a moment ago. Some of the things that we have in place that we'll be doing, the 2024 Futures Conference will be held. I believe that one is in March of next year. We'll have open forums available so people can come and share their comments and their input about their perceptions, opinions about the priorities for the college. And we'll make surveys available as well. Something we may do new for this year that we haven't done before is, as the strategic planning team is discussing specific topics, for example, talking about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, that strategic planning classic, we may run surveys a few weeks before each of those conversations, so the community members, employees, students can provide their own input on what they think about the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats in the case of that one, about institutional context, about the competitive landscape, whatever topic it might be that the planning team will be discussing, so that we can have broad avenues of input, which will then go to the strategic planning team for discussion to see what it means and what action the college may want to take in terms of priorities to respond to the input we're receiving. The future of PCC is critical. We'll be embedding some futures methods into the upcoming year. Just a section around that this time around. When we engage in the next comprehensive planning process, when we're looking at the education master plan, facilities master plan, a full start from scratch strategic plan, there'll be more of a futures focus. But there are a number of things that we all know are critical that we need to think about. Evolving technology and the impact of that on the classroom. The kind of the enrollment dynamic we have, where we see increasing online enrollment and declining on-site enrollment. That has fundamental questions that it raises for the future of the institution that need to be given very careful attention. Growth of competition. We have Udemy, Coursera, those kinds of entities. We have we see an increase in online, but online education means many other institutions can attract students from markets outside their typical catchment area. So there are things we need to consider. And of course, we have changing community demographics. We know, just as an example, that in the upcoming few decades, we will see an increase in the number of Hispanic residents within our community. It will remain flatter for our white non-Hispanic population. We have to think about what that means in terms of the services we provide and the education we provide. And this last one, it's something we've talked about for a long time at the institution, is declining perceived value of an education. We had a very interesting conversation at ELT this morning related to this and the dynamics behind it. But one of the key factors that's thought to be driving this decline in perceived value relates to the financial barrier of an education. And when we think about that in connection with our mission to transform lives through affordable education, through our, specifically in that case, a purpose statement, there's this key need for us to think about how do we provide the offerings that our learners need or our potential learners need in an affordable way and communicate the benefits to them if they earn a certificate or a degree or an industry credential or whatever it might be. So these are some of the future aspects we need to think about. And so this gives you a little bit of a flavor of some of the things that will be as part of that strategic planning process. But I wanted to bring forward a question for the board. And the question is written here is, as we think about Pima over the next 3 years, what priorities does the board consider to be important? But something I might add as an alternate way to think about this, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. As we think about the college down the road, the decisions we make today are intended to build a college that the community needs. And it's the college it needs today, but it's also to anticipate those needs. And we're really working to build the college of 2030, 2040. And so in addition to hearing from the board about the priorities that you consider important over that 3-year time frame, if you were to build, and we'll do this as a thought experiment initially, the ideal college to meet the needs of Pima County, what would that college look like? And of course, we're not building a new college from scratch. We have Pima here and it's a great college. But as we think about strategic planning, it's kind of like, what's that ideal state? What does a college, what does a community need from the community college? And if we can build that picture and that sense of like, oh, we need to look like this, we need this, we need this, whatever this might be, really, when we engage in planning, we're thinking about what are the shorter term 2 to 3 year steps we need to take to transform Pima into that future state that will meet what the community needs. And so that's kind of the background a little bit. I am going to stop showing my screen just for a moment because I can't see anybody with my screen shared. Actually, now I just see myself twice. But I'd like to invite the input of the board. What do you think in terms of the college of the future? What stands out to you as something that really resonates, that would be important for the community down the road? Or just right now, as you understand about the college today, what stands out to you as a priority? So please share your comments.
Hello, this is Board Member Garcia. First of all, I think what we really need to do is we need to assess the space that we have, what it's costing us, and then secondly, the future college conference. How many of those people are really from the outside? Are they normally staff members? Are they college employees? I don't know that we're really getting the information outside, because when you bring, normally the future conferences are in the daytime, during the week, it's not out in the community. So you're not really getting all that information from everybody. Then the other thing too is to assess within the entire Pima County and the outlying areas, the needs are different throughout the area. You're not going to get people from the Catalinas to come to Pima College. So then my next question is, why is it that the U of A has increased their enrollment from the south side and Pima has not? I don't know what the answer is, but I just think that we're not getting the information that we need to set up a good plan. And if you ask me what I think that the college needs, we need to be available within all the areas, but in order to do that, we need to assess what those needs are. We have spent a lot of time and effort on building trades. That's all well and great. But in addition, we need to also educate the community. As an Hispanic, I don't want all my people to just be working for somebody. They need to, and then the other part of it too that we need to look at, during the pandemic, a lot of the assessment scores from the high schools have declined tremendously, especially in the math, especially in the writing skills. So Pima then would need to pick that up. I'm not sure that when we say that the competition is impacting us greatly. The reason I say that is because I know that primarily my community cannot afford that. So anyway, that's my take on this. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Dr. Richmond, this is Teresa Riel, and I just have a couple of questions from the presentation. If you would you don't have to answer these right now if you don't have them for me, but just when you get a chance within the next week or two. I've heard people mention, and this isn't the first time, but there have been other times, and they say there's a faculty co-chair. It'd be nice to know who that person is. So that's number one. Number two, institutional targets. So I've seen those pictures previously, but did we meet our institutional targets for year one and year two? That's the 60% completing a degree, certificate, or credential. And then number three, it said restructure all offerings around areas of interest. Oh, I actually have one more. So I don't know what that means. It'd be nice to understand. I mean, I understand what an area of interest is, but what does that statement mean as far as what the college is doing? What was the recent learner survey, and what did it tell us? So those are, I guess, my 4 questions that I had. I'm going to just mention real quick what I think it would be nice to see us do at the college. It would be nice to survey students each and every semester and ask them what they're planning on taking as far as coursework and which campus do they want to take it at. Obviously, we won't be able to meet everybody's needs, but if we don't understand where our students are coming from and what they need by asking them those specific questions, there's a good chance that we'll schedule classes at the wrong place, the wrong time, whatever. I'm concerned about the one comment about online enrollment going up and in-person enrollment going down. Anybody who's ever taken a lab class, a chemistry lab or a physics lab, I'm not sure how we can teach one of those labs when students are in their own homes, because obviously they're not going to have the chemical apparatus. I'm sure there's a plural word for that, but I don't know what it is. And so I'm just concerned that I was talking to some adjunct faculty a couple of weeks ago. They invited me for lunch, and they were mentioning that they were teaching an online lab course for I think it was a biology class or maybe chemistry. And I'm just concerned that, sure, we can offer them that way, but is it really the best way for a student to get educated and learn materials? And then I'm going to agree with Board Member Garcia. I think that it's really important to make sure that the offerings that we offer to areas of town where they don't have the same opportunities other areas have. Are we offering enough science courses at Desert Vista, for example? If we're not offering science courses at Desert Vista, there are a lot of those students, I would assume, that would find it impossible to get up to the Northwest campus or even maybe the West campus or the downtown campus. And so I want to make sure that this college is offering the citizens of Pima County equal and fair access to everything that we have to offer, obviously within reason. I know we can't have an aviation program at each of the campuses, but we can definitely have higher level, and not just higher level, we can definitely have math and science at all the campuses. So I would hope that we're meeting the needs of the community by offering the appropriate courses at the appropriate campuses. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the input. And I can, if I may, let me just take a quick moment. I'll respond to the questions that you had. You asked about the faculty co-chair. We don't have the team members identified for the team for this upcoming year, but during the last planning process, the faculty co-chair was Anthony Sovak, and in the planning process before that, it was Michael Parker. They've both moved into different roles now, but they were faculty at the time they were the co-chairs. Regarding the institutional targets, no, we have not currently met those targets as they were set for year 1 and year 2 of the plan. Unfortunately, as the plan was being developed is around about when the pandemic hit, and we didn't know at that point what the impact was going to be. We do have strategies in place that will be working to increase completed counts over the next 2 years. So that's going to be close if we're ultimately successful on those goals. And that's an area that kind of everybody on the operations side of the institution, and when I say operation, I mean within the institution, academic, student affairs, other areas need to be focused around. Restructuring around areas of interest. This one was developed by the planning team to try and make ourselves more understandable to people outside the institution. Right now, for example, if somebody is interested in, say, a GED or an IBEST program, they need to go to the adult education area of the website. If they're interested in a traditional welding degree, they would go to what's currently listed as areas of interest under the regular credit part of the website. The purpose here was to take the current areas of interest we have for credit programs and weave in the other pathways. So if a student is interested in, for example, applied technology, they could go there and they would see in one area our credit certificates, credit degrees, our fast track programs, any IBEST programs, any industry certs that they might be able to earn through that area. And so it's really kind of changing the website so it isn't structured how we are operationally, but it kind of hopefully makes more sense to the learner. So it's easier for them to find something that would match their interests and what they're looking for. The learner surveys are the engagement surveys that we did. Those are a year or 2 old now, but those were assessed last year as part of the Chancellor's goals, and we have recommendations now. So to look at those recommendations and see what we need to do. So those are some of the key pieces, but thank you, Chair Rial. I made note of all your input and I will make sure we follow up on those pieces as we will for Board Member Garcia's comments. Are there other comments from the board?
Yeah, I have a few. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that are important, but the three that are standing out to me immediately, I mean, I would concur with what Board Member Garcia said, you know, and especially given what you just presented in terms of the changing demographics, the shift in more students looking for online education, and certainly the realities of what the college's own enrollment has been. I have questions about whether our administrative infrastructure in the broadest sense of that, including physical space and staffing levels and all of that, is going to be appropriate, or is appropriate to meet our current needs and then appropriate to meet our future needs. And I think you covered that some in your presentation, so I concur with that. The other piece that's important to me is that we sustain the level of engagement that we have had with the larger business community in Tucson to make sure we're continuing to offer relevant degrees, certificates, degrees, whatever that might be, that can translate immediately into local employment, so that it goes back to that diminishing value of education comment that you had. I mean, if we can continue to show, yes, this will link you directly with an available, you know, good paying job that's in this community, that puts our students on a path for success, and it helps the local economy, which is great as well. And then the third piece for me is HLC compliance. Is, you know, if our accreditation is threatened in some way, that's disastrous all around. And so, you know, continuing to make sure we're successful through the next, well, not only the next year and year plus that we have this reaccreditation process, but then into the future. So those are the three that stand out for me.
Great, thank you. I've made note of those. I'll make sure that we follow up on those during the planning process. Thank you. Are there any other comments from the board?
This is Wade McLean. I agree with my fellow board members on the comments and suggestions that they make. Can you articulate a little bit? I'm assuming by the fact that we're having this conversation that this is a plan in progress, and it's more or less a living, breathing document that evolves through the course of time. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation until 3 or 4 years later. But how does this input get considered and placed into the conversation about how to modify the strategic plan?
That's a great question. So when the team is finalized, we have a structured planning process that group will walk through. As part of the background and initial meeting, when we're talking about the direction of the institution, I'll be sharing the input from the board with that group. It's critical, of course, with the roles you have, that your input and the things that are important to you are fed into the strategic planning team, so we can keep those front and center as we're engaging in these different conversations to bring back, hopefully, a plan for the board's consideration in which you will see your input reflected, and you will see strategies and substantive activities the college can take in the next few years, through to 26 in the case of this one, to move the college in the right direction. And so all of these comments will be forwarded to that group. And as mentioned, this is a stakeholder group. We have a strategic plan, or we will have a planning team of about 22 to 25 people. It includes a group identified by Faculty Senate, from whom the faculty co-chair will be selected. And that group will have a number of different sessions where they'll think about different aspects of the institution. I mentioned a SWOT analysis. They'll also have an institutional context conversation about the culture of the college, the history of the college, the complexity. We'll talk about a competitor analysis to see who else has offerings within the community we serve that are accessible, that might be comparable, but there'll be a real central focus on the needs of the community. And Board Member Garcia, I heard your comments loud and clear about having more effective ways. One of my team let me know that about 48% of the Futures Conference attendees of the current year were community members. But I know that when we go back a few years, we had more community members involved then. And so finding avenues to get meaningful community input into the process is critical. But essentially, we'll have these conversations, lots of different topics will come up, and we'll look for commonalities across those conversations. And that's how we'll kind of coalesce into the recommended strategies that will come forward to the board. Did that address your question?
Yes, but let me give you a specific. In the next year or so, the board has said that they want to have several conversations about specific roles of the college. One in particular is the cost versus rewards of a program in the college. How much does it cost you to attain the degree or the certificate, and how much will you make in that area, that occupation, when you receive that diploma or that certificate? And when we have that conversation, does that automatically get rolled into the conversation of revising the strategic plan?
That will, particularly during this year. I make sure I attend any of the board meetings, listen to the discussion, hear the priorities that are going on. And one of my jobs is trying to make sure the strategic plan is connected to the different initiatives and conversations that are going on. Because we've sometimes in the past been in a situation where we've had the strategic plan kind of over here, but a different discussion topic, which is really important, going on somewhere else, but it lives slightly outside the strategic plan. It might be something through the education plan, the facilities plan, and we end up with this slightly disaggregated system, which can result in people feeling overloaded. We have too many priorities. And the goal for the strategic plan is to try and pull those critical things together into one place. And when it relates to things like programs, that's a critical connection to the strategic plan, because it ties into the conversation of what do we stop doing and where do we redistribute our resources to make sure that we take the resources we have and we're using them in the optimum way to best meet the needs of the community. And that's part of the function of the strategic plan, to figure out how we move forward in that. And so those program conversations, the other assessment related topics that kind of relate to that fourth of the chances goals, I will be busy in the background listening to the conversations, getting the different information to the planning team, and helping support the construction of a very comprehensive plan that's going to cover these different pieces in a coherent way. So we have one clear vision for the next few years to move the college forward.
Thank you.
If I could add something too, we'll see a common thread with the interim chancellor's goals too. We talked about HLC, enrollment, retention, completion, effective efficiencies. So that's including the space utilization, the programs. So it's all tied together, which I think will make it very seamless as we go through this process. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the input. Are there any other comments from the board on this topic? Okay, great. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate your comments, and I look forward to bringing back this topic to you as the strategic plan takes shape. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to discussion item 2.3, the governing board study session topics for 2023-2024.
Yes, so we flip-flop the agenda items. We're going to start off with that, and then we'll continue with the administrative reports to the governing board. And I'll ask Jeff to join us in the conversation about the study session topics. And I think we have that on the screen too that we'll be showing in a moment. If not, I think the board members have it in their agenda too.
Yeah. That's exactly the right one. Oh.
It's showing on this big screen. It'll be coming up in the other screens in a moment.
You can see it. There we go. And it doesn't. So hopefully this was helpful. It's hard to see all of it on this screen. So what we tried to do is give you a snapshot of the regular board meeting schedule with meetings where we knew there would be a specific issue that board would need to make a decision about. Budget is probably the most common example. And then Below that, we put a variety of potential study session topics. This is based upon feedback from the board retreat and just kind of feedback that board members have submitted over the last few months. And so we tried to create a basic study session schedule that tracked those and was as aligned as sort of in a way we thought kind of matched up with what some of the regular meeting topics would be, and with some level of prioritization based on time sensitivity. One of the things we sort of discovered in this exercise is there are a lot of really important topics. It's hard to figure out how to get them all into the annual calendar with enough time that does each one justice. But anyway, this was just a preliminary attempt. So this was really just to create a starting framework so that it would give a place for the board to start a discussion. And the real question for this evening is, well, two questions. One is whether the timing of this seems to be okay, or whether you think we need to, move something earlier or something later. And then the second related question is whether there's any significant topic that was missed. And I guess the two caveats I'll put in there is it probably doesn't have every topic that a board member asked about, at least at this point in time. Like I said, we try to do some prioritization here. Not that any topic's not important, but we tried to work on time sensitivity. And the second thing, just for the board to think about, is as the chancellor's search process progresses, either we're going to need to incorporate some conversations into those study sessions or have additional meetings. It's just something to think about for the context here, that this schedule does not, sorry, I'm trying to see if I can get away from the echoing. This study session schedule doesn't address that yet, in part because we don't have a firm schedule for the key milestones in the search process yet.
And so far, this is showing a study session once a month, correct? So that's another option too, if you want to have more than one a month.
Thank you for doing this. It's very helpful. I'd just like to make a comment that, for example, study session November 2023, that might be a topic that we have on the rest of the board meetings for that fiscal year, as well as the study sessions for that fiscal year. So I would just like to make a comment that these are not just snapshots and an end all of the conversation, but a beginning of the conversation, because I think it's going to take us several months to get through that conversation on budget, staffing, raises, land acquisition, all those topics. And it could be that we just carry that forward and we bite off different pieces of that throughout the study sessions that are scheduled the rest of the year.
Absolutely. I guess one other thing to think about is the board doesn't have to decide every study session topic now, right? And things are going to happen during the year, or as Dr. McLean mentioned, you might discuss something and realize we need to have a follow-up conversation, and all that's, of course. What would be helpful is if the board could sort of commit to what, say, the study sessions are through the end of this semester. That gives the staff time to do adequate planning and make sure that we're fully prepared for that. After that, like I said, it's great if this is the tentative schedule, but fully understanding you may want to make changes as we progress. But like I said, if there was some level of commitment at least to the first 2 or 3 for planning purposes, that would be extremely helpful.
It makes sense to me from a sort of general plan. I'm understanding that it's dynamic and things can come up and we can shift things around, but from a general approach, everything that's up there makes sense to me.
Okay, on my end, the complaint process, I don't know if the rest of the board agrees, but I think that needs to be moved up. ODR. I think that's going to take a while to get done, and so, and it's a major problem here.
So you're thinking of moving it up to what month, perhaps?
I don't know, we can start working it in November. If not, then at least by January.
And not in one of those meetings, but let's add a second meeting one of those 2 months.
Sorry, when you say in those months, which months do you mean?
I think she said November or January. Was that what you
Okay.
said?
23 November.
November 2023 and January 2024.
Okay.
And then, Mr. Sylvan, I was also wondering about our board policies. I think it's a policy in our board policies that we have to review them or revise them every 3 years. And of the myriad policies that I've looked at, a lot of them haven't been revised in the last 3 years. So can we make that, I mean, the easy ones that don't have any big language change or anything, can we front load those? And my question for that is because if HLC dings us that we haven't done that work for the last many years, if it's easy, let's just get it done.
So apparently, we're all on the same wavelength here. So the governance groups just got a fairly large batch which are the ones we think fit into that category. Either there's no change suggested or it's a very minor language change suggested. I expect you're going to see those at the October meeting. So on this tentative calendar, I put 3 different board meetings to do board policy review. The idea being we're going to break them into batches and do one batch at a time. And again, this was kind of a best guess as to what the timing will be of when different things go through the governance process. That's one of those where things might move a bit. But anyway, the idea was at least the first batch would get to the board in October after around the time of the end of the governance group review, so we could get through the first batch fairly quickly, because those are the ones that probably don't require much discussion or change.
Okay, so I have 2 more that I'd like, I'm not sure where they would lay, but basically, I'd like to be able to review the staffing levels of the college, and also to review the college legal model.
So I'm wondering, I'm not sure about the timing of assessment, but I'm sort of wondering whether we could maybe incorporate the staffing model assessment into one or more of the budget-focused study sessions. Would that fit with what you're thinking, or did you have something different in mind?
Well, first of all, I would think we need to do an assessment first. Then we would need to do like what is required for the college to provide services to the students. Then we would need to look at the people that we do have that perhaps we shouldn't have.
Okay, so that sounds like, I don't know what to call it. It's sort of like an internal research project first, and then go to the board with the outcome so that the board might use that to inform a variety of decisions.
So I would think that would have to happen before March, when the new contracts are approved.
So that would have to be part of the budget. So where would you recommend we would insert that so that we would have enough time to have that conversation before we approve any potential budget decisions?
Well, so one issue is just going to be, how long that might take to do, which is not something I'm able to answer.
So we have Dr. B here, maybe.
Or maybe Carlene, I don't think she's here, could give us a rough estimate. Do you have any feel for that? To do a staffing assessment? You-
Good afternoon. The beginning of that conversation is going to be part of the budget conversation in November. We're going to talk about staffing ratios, historical trends in terms of staffing, that sort of thing. I think that probably is the best start, and then following up on any board questions or follow-up that the board wants to have after we have that basic beginning conversation. I think that'll be queued up nicely to start with the November and then add as needed. But we will be definitely providing that as part of the November conversation.
That'll be included in the November study session. Okay.
Additional detail, we'll just, that's what the study sessions are for, is to provide information, and then if the board wants additional information, we can schedule work on that. We'll sort of identify the timeline that we think it will take. I don't anticipate that there will be any huge challenges with questions that the board may have, that we can just, through the normal budget cycle, can address those questions.
So one of the questions that I have is the fact that administratively, we have a lot of top-heavy, administrators. So with that being said, I don't believe that the faculty nor the staff itself is overly populated. So you'll have to convince me, or the college will have to convince us that that's not the case. And so on the administrative levels.
Okay. I mean, the board, we have provided the information in the past, how many people we have in either administrative positions and or management level positions, because there's two slightly different definitions, along with staffing, along with faculty, and sort of head comparison versus peer institutions. That's what we're working on. We will provide that as sort of the starting point. And again, then we'll follow up with questions after that.
And primarily responsibilities of the executive team.
Okay.
And I don't know how difficult this would be, but that budget that was online a year and a half ago, I would like to see something like that again at some point as we move into the budget process, just because that gave me a lot of insight to, what kind of the number of employees we had and where they were situated and how that whole thing played out.
The other thing that I think I'd be happy to do for the board is, again, in the lead into that November conversation, and then providing in the study session that information, but there's also a bunch of dashboards that are worth the board being aware of where they are, so that we can, and information that we typically put on the website. So we'll update some of the information, and then I'll also make sure that you know where the links are to get additional information that we have out there routinely.
That'd be great. Thank you.
I just want, and I don't know, I feel like I need to underline this point, but I just want to make sure you have enough time, because, I think what Board Member Garcia was saying, I concur with part of it, which is that assessment piece, right? Like, if we look at a list of how many staff or how many whatever, like that, or even if we look at ratios, like those are guides, but like ultimately what I'm hoping that I could hear from you all is an actual assessment of, based on what we were just talking about a minute ago, the future needs of the college, what do you need and at what ratio? Because I can't tell you that. It might be different than what it's been in the past. I have no idea. And so I would love to get some sense in that process. Again, we're going back to the strategy driving the budget rather than budget driving the strategy that we talked about before. If you all can tell me this is what we need for the future, whatever that is, fill in the blank based on whatever assessment you're doing, and then we can go from there. I don't have a particular interest in micromanaging who does what. You all can figure that out, but what I want to see is evidence that there's been critical thought given to what do we really need and how do we get there, and then that, whatever that looks like, then we can go from there.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Jeff?
I have a proposed motion. I move that we approve the study session calendar as presented, understanding that it is a fluid document and will be modified from time to time, and also to incorporate the ODR comments, the conversation about policies, and the evaluation of staffing and college legal models to be included, and those being preliminarily discussed in November.
Is there a second?
So I don't think we noticed this for an action, but in any case, you don't really need to make a motion. We'll take all this into consideration and come back with an updated calendar.
So no votes are taking
Well,
place?
unless it was noticed as an action item, and without looking at it, I don't remember off the top of my head.
It's just
Just a discussion item, yeah.
But it seems like folks are in consensus?
It seemed like there's a pretty clear direction, so what I'm thinking is we can make some adjustments to this, email it back to you, you can look at it and see if you think we correctly tracked what you had in mind, and then take additional feedback. And as noted, this is a planning document, it's not a rule we're following, so we can continue to have these conversations as the fall progresses and make adjustments as the board thinks would be helpful.
Just one last thing, Jeff. I would say let's, since we're going to think of this as a fluid document, let's say we accept the whole fiscal year calendar, not just through the end of the semester. And then if there are things we need to change, we can add or augment. Okay, thanks.
Great.
Okay, moving back to item 2.2, administrative reports to the governing board.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to bring back Dr. Nick Richmond to continue this conversation of administrative reports to the governing board. That's why we wanted to start off with a study session topic, so the board would have an idea as to what's going to be looked at in the future. And so based on that, and Nick will explain the conversation, the discussion right now. Do you see something missing? Would you like administrative reports? Do you like the format that we've been using in the past? So anyway, I'll pass it to Dr. Richmond so she can elaborate. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'll share my screen briefly as we start the conversation. So available in the board materials is a 2-page document, which is the approved list of reports to the governing board that was put in place for the 22-23 year. There's been a reporting calendar for the board in years before that. This was a shift for last year. And so part of the discussion today, we're interested to hear if this kind of approach works for the current board, or if there are additional reports, a different kind of report format you would like to see. So on the first page, there is a schedule of monthly administrative reports to be given at the Wednesday evening board meetings. The format for these is that a slide deck is prepared and also an executive summary, both of which are provided in advance so the board can review the materials and ask any questions in advance or during the board meeting. The topics, as you can see listed here, cover a number of key areas. So a monthly update on different chancellor's goals, which we would, of course, update for the board, the goals that you approved last week. And then also each month there is a HLC update focusing on one of the criteria for accreditation or federal compliance. Also last year in March and April, we included updates on 3 of the new college-wide plans that were coming online last year or intended to come online last year. So the DEI plan, the Strategic Enrollment Management Plan, and the Climate Action Sustainability Plan. And then in May, we had the update related to Achieve 60 Pima County and the strategic plan. In a couple of key places in the fall and the spring, there was also an enrollment update given by David Ariano and Phil Burdick. So that's the oral reports at the Wednesday evening board meetings. And accompanying that, there are a set of written reports identified to be released to the board. These are not all annual reports. Some of them are, some of them aren't. So for example, the college employee satisfaction survey and the student engagement surveys are not annual, but last year we did have results to release from those, and so we did. But others give enrollment information, FTSE information from the state. The VFA outcomes report is one of our main accountability reports that compares us to other colleges in the area of credit success, fall to next term retention, 2-year and 6-year graduation and transfer and other outcomes, things like that. We have benchmark data from iPads, including in a December report. And I should note some of these are tentative timelines because sometimes the reports outside the college are delayed, so we release them as soon as they're available. And then other reports related to student enrollment, both for fall and spring. There were two reports, one of which is tentative to be determined for the student employment report. This continues to be a struggle to obtain employment information. It's top priority within STAR to figure out a route forward for this. We're working on a statewide effort, which seems to which is moving forward, but not as quickly as we might like it to. And then we are looking to establish an institutional effectiveness report, which we planned to do last year, but with competing priorities related to doing the initial drafts of areas of the assurance argument, which fall within STAR, that was a little bit delayed, but that continues to be a priority to put in place. So these are the current reports as it stands, as approved by the previous board. And so what we'd like to do is to invite your input on whether these broad topics are of interest and relevant for the board, if there are topics that are missing, and whether the format of an executive summary with accompanying slides for these reports on the Wednesday evening works effectively for the governing board, or if you would like something different. So really, how can we best provide information to you to ensure you are current on what's going on and have access to key metrics and key data points about the institution? And with that, I will stop showing my screen, but you have access to this in your packets. And I would love to hear comments and perspectives of the board.
I just have a quick question about the second page. There's a little footnote number 2 on the bottom, and I'm just assuming that that's about the executive summaries. Am I correct there? Or is number 2 missing?
Where it relates to it's actually it connects to the release month for the enrollment reports. Those were listed to be released in July, August, September, October, but based on the timeline, release didn't start until October. And because we've been in a little bit of limbo, pending input on the direction for these reports, we haven't released it so far for the fall, but we do have it on the project list within STAR to make sure that goes out in September if the board is interested in receiving that report.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and we would like to see those. Thank you.
Dr. Richmond, I have a question. I'm not sure. Is Hilda still employed here? I thought she went to NAU.
Yes, that's correct. She's listed here because she was here at the institution when this list was approved last year. For this year now, if that remains as an update for the board, that would be Brian Stewart that would be providing that based on current responsibilities.
Okay, so you have a new person assigned to that position?
Yes, in addition,
Yes.
so Brian Stewart is the campus vice president for Northwest Campus, but has also assumed the responsibilities for DEI, basically. And what we're looking at here is this past year's calendar, basically, of admin reports. But we wanted to know if you like this format and the general topics, we can add more to it if you like.
I don't have any, I mean, the topics themselves seem fine to me in terms of what's in there. The only really, I guess for lack of a better word, like editorial comment that I have is for the presentations that we get at the board meeting. I can only speak for myself, but I do feel like they're pretty narrative heavy on like what has been done, and I'm less concerned about like the specifics of who did what and when, and more concerned about the outcomes that it's generating. So if we could, I feel, and I don't have like hard data on this, but just my impression is it's like a lot of the things we hear is like 80% narrative or more, and then like 10 or 20% the actual how did the needle move and what needle are we moving. And I would love that to be the reverse, like real quick narrative of what, 5 minutes or less on what exactly was done, and then the rest of the time just give me the data, like what's moving, it started at X, it went to Y, the goal is to get to Z, we're on track, we're not on track, and I would love to see more about the outcomes, because right now I feel like we spend a lot of time talking through what's done, and not that it's not good work and a tribute to everybody that's doing it, just that part is less relevant for me personally. I want to see what needle is moving and how much.
And I know we've talked about this before, but it'd be nice to always have the numbers and what they mean, not just percent growth or percent decline, because if we don't know what it started at or what it was, that, percent I mean, somebody can just say it went up or it went down if we don't have the data. Thank you.
Excellent, good, thank you. Are there other comments, both in terms of the written reports that we would be sending to the board if you support this list, or the reports that go forward at the Wednesday meetings? And I would note, as for the discussion around study sessions, we can move forward with this list or an adjusted version of this, but adjust during the course of the year as other needs and interests arise. This doesn't have to be something that's kind of locked in and we can't change during the year. We can adjust as needed during the year.
Okay, thank you. That's great. And I think we're all, we are in agreement with what you presented. So thank you, Dr. Richmond.
Great, thank you.
Okay, moving on to discussion item 2.4, possible direction regarding the chancellor search process.
So we're going to invite Jeff Sylvan to the podium and to explain and facilitate the conversation with all of you.
Thank you. So a couple of questions for the board to consider this evening and provide some direction on. One is related to advisory committees to assist with the chancellor search process. And there's a couple different options that could be used here. So one is, if you remember back originally when the plan had been to do an acting and interim and then a regular search process, the board was going to pick an advisory committee to provide feedback and winnow the list of search firms that would assist in the selection of identification of candidates for interim. So that didn't happen because the plan changed. So one question for the board is, would you like to use an advisory committee to help identify the most appropriate search firm to assist in the placement of the regular chancellor? That's sort of one question. Another is whether you would like an I'm assuming there's interest in having an advisory committee that has some broad representation to assist in the assessment of candidates and to share those perspectives with the board. So one question is, would you rather have one committee focused on one issue and one committee focused on the search firm selection and a separate committee focused on the candidate evaluation, or would you like to have one group that does both? There's some trade-offs for doing that, right? So if we had two different committees, the committee that focuses on evaluation of search firms we could pick people who have a particular experience with that, how to pick a recruiter, how to pick a potential consultant for the college versus people evaluating candidates. At least we're proposing a different kind of expertise, right? So having representation from different types of employees around the college, faculty, staff, students, community members, having that be a different kind of makeup. So that's one question of if you have strong feelings one way or the other with respect to that direction.
So this is a little different. We're going to discuss this before we make the motion. Is that?
Oh, yeah, yes, because there's sort of a lot of interrelated concepts here. And so it seemed like it might be easier to do that. Although if someone, I'm not saying that to preclude someone, if a board member has a strong feeling and you'd like to make a motion one way or the other, then absolutely that's an appropriate way to proceed.
I guess I don't have strong feelings, but just like for the sake of discussion, I mean, as I'm thinking about it, and I know that there's trade-offs, but it sort of seems like you'd want a different skill set for the people that are evaluating the search firms than you would for the people that are evaluating the candidates. And so then in my mind, I mean, you could invite some people from the search firm committee to also be on the other one, I suppose. They could carry forward, but for the sake of discussion, I guess my initial leaning, again, which is not strong and really is to have two groups, but again, I'm not like married to that.
I think it would give a broader participation rate too. You know, there's more things that the community and college employees can participate in. So I think that's a great idea.
I'm in agreement that the two committees would better serve us.
Me too. So with that, I move the college create an advisory committee with no more than 7 members, including the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Human Resources or her designee, along with community members having expertise in executive recruiting, human resources management, or consultant selection processes to provide recommendations to the governing board regarding the selection of a firm to conduct the search for the chancellor position.
Second.
Not hearing any more discussion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0.
Madam Chair, I'm going to make the following motion with the understanding that I may be amenable to amendments from my fellow board members. I move that the college create an advisory committee with no more than 17 members to provide recommendations to the governing board regarding the chancellor search process, and in particular with the evaluation of applicants. And I think the second part of this motion should be a separate motion, so I'll wait on that.
I'll second it, but I have a question too, just in terms of what this motion weight is just to, we're saying we're creating a committee, right? Because my immediate following question is like, well, who picks who's on the committee? So, but maybe that's the second part that you're talking about, so.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, I'm on board to create a committee, so yeah.
Hearing no more discussion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0.
Madam Chair, I have a couple of questions I think are pertinent before I make a motion on the selection of the committee. And two of them are when we have a category of the proposed committee representative from an organization, do we need to identify who selects the participant for that organization? Because I think we would have to recognize the organization, because some of these are pretty vague and they could be considered a number of organizations in this community. So that's one question. And the second question is, if we were to approve this, we maybe should talk about the selection of a chair or the individual who determines the decision-making process, or a facilitator in that group. Otherwise, we should just say they're going to do their own thing, and I'm not sure we want to leave it that wide open. So I think we could have a little bit of discussion before we move into this thing and try to firm it up a little bit, if that's okay.
So when I was talking to the folks, the board at the college that former Chancellor Lee Lambert went to, 3 of their board members were also on the committee. And is that what you're talking about, the chair, or are you saying that one of us would be on there and would be the chair? Or are you saying that we would choose one of those 17 people to be the chair?
I think if we have board members on this committee, they should be ex officio, non-voting, because you're going to get to vote later anyway. And I would hate to see us unduly influence the members of this committee, because we want them to be voices of the community, not voices of the governing board. So I would caution us to not put voting members of the board on voting members of this committee. And let me give you an example of what my concern is. One of the suggested groups is community group. Who determines who the community group is and how that person is going to be selected? So this needs a lot of work. And if we can't do it this evening, I'm okay with having another conversation about who would be on here so that we could get rolling with with the selection of the search committee immediately, getting this first group together. I think this might be a little complicated when we get into the nuts and bolts of this advisory committee. So, and that's just one example, and there's going to be almost every one of these groups that's going to be hard to define for somebody else. I mean, we can do it, but it's not going to be easy.
To help with that, so we provided a kind of an idea of the types of perspectives, at least we were thinking about. If the board is okay with those and has others, we can go talk to different people who are associated with those organizations to see who is interested and available to serve, and then bring back a bigger list that you can then look at. Or if individual if board members have particular individuals they think, because of their affiliation with one of those groups, that would be a good candidate, you're certainly welcome to suggest those. And again, we can go talk to them and make sure they're interested and available to do the work, and then bring back that list of here's the perspective they bring, and then here's the ones that are indeed available and willing.
So with your permission, let me try something. I further move that a representative from each of the following organizations or groups be included on the committee, and that each board member may suggest a definition of that group and or an individual for inclusion into the committee, and also have staff do the same. Understanding that we're not going to clarify everything today, but everybody gets a chance to have input into what these groups mean and what the selection process would be. And I'll pick on the Pima Foundation. We know what the Pima Foundation is, but does the CEO going to be the one that picks the representative? I would say yes, but that's an example that we identify the leadership position that makes the selection. Okay, Marcy?
Yeah, so just so I understand, sorry, so there's going to be a list, we're going to get it, or we already have it, but we're going to get that list, and then each of us are going to start tossing names to somebody, and then there's a big list? Is that what, am I following?
What I would see happening is one of the suggested groups is Pima County Business Group, and a possibility would be you saying, I think that should be SALC, and that the CEO of the SALC should appoint the representative.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
So I think the decision would be, if another person said that that group should be the, Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and then, there'd be two names that are put forth, and we'd have to decide as a group, which of those, the board would have to decide which of those we're going with.
And if we defer that conversation until we have the information, it will give us all a chance to think about it. And that staff would present those suggestions that they receive from board members and staff on a list that we could sort through. That might take a while.
Yeah, it might, but I think conceptually that makes sense. I mean, the only other thought I had in my head was maybe there might be value in us naming like the chair first, and then let that chair work with us to help fine tune the list, not without us, but yeah.
That would make sense if you want to identify that poor soul in public before we talk to them.
I'm not saying we identify them now.
If we did that, they wouldn't have much choice, would they? Maybe that's another category where we make recommendations and we also hear from staff on who that person might be.
Sure.
So the board has a final decision on who's going to be selected to represent, correct? The two that I would propose that we consider would be a faculty person, I don't know which one, and a student.
My answer to your first part of that question is no, because we're going to identify the person or position that's going to make the selection on who would be on the committee, not the actual name of the person inside that organization. So the example I used was a foundation, and we would say to Marcy, pick somebody from your foundation to be on the committee, and we wouldn't pick the person. The CEO of that group would pick the person.
We need to have final decision, though, acknowledging their expertise and that they know their constituents, but I think the board needs to have final decision on each person.
So then I would also comment that if you want to participate in this group as a board member, that you do it in an ex officio manner where you don't get a vote. Your vote will be on the selection of the chancellor, not the selection of who goes forward on the list to the board.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. Okay, so is there a second to this motion?
Second.
It's recorded. Okay, hearing no more discussion, all in favor of Wade's third motion, say aye.
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 Passes 4-0.
Can we back up to the first committee for a second? So we gave a list of people as examples of people we think have the type of experience that would be helpful in giving advice to the board about evaluating the search firms, not the individuals. So I'm going to go back to your playbook here for a second. And let's chat for a minute about how do we finalize who's on that list, right? So there's a list of people who haven't necessarily said yes, but there are people we think are inclined to say yes and who have the right kind of expertise. We could go to those people and bring them back, or the other question is, do you want a little time, and I mean a little time, to give us some other suggestions on who you think might be well suited to serving on a committee to help you pick a recruiting firm, and then we could again come back to you with a list and say, okay, pick 7 from this list.
I haven't, to be honest, I haven't done really anything with that list. I mean, I would like a chance to see if I, can talk to some of the, I don't even remember off the top of my head who's on that list, to be totally honest. So I'd to look at it again, but if there's any of the, for example, like large employers in the area, their HR folks, like I might be able to add some strong possibilities in there, and maybe from some circles that don't interact with the college often, so it might be a nice way to engage some of those other potential partners.
About how much, what do you think interval of time for that to happen?
I should be able to get you some names next week.
And could you resupply us that list? Because I can't, it's not in front of me right now.
I'm happy after this meeting to resend it.
Thank you.
So if we want to do that, maybe Andrea could poll the board. We could have a really quick meeting the week after for the board to give you enough time to see if there's anyone else, think about the folks on the list, and then pick the group. That way we can get rolling.
Just from a process standpoint, we're picking the names, and the names we're picking are getting invitations to participate, correct? So they can decline, or we're asking them before to confirm they want to be part of it.
So my suggestion to move this along is the sooner we have the names, the better, so we can reach out to those individuals and say, okay, this is the task we're asking you to help the board with. This is an approximate time frame of when that work would take place. Do you have the interest and the scheduling availability, so that we would only give you names of people for decision who have said, yes, I'm willing and able to serve. That's why I'm saying if you have suggestions, that would be great. You could give them a heads up that we're going to contact them, and then they will contact them, and that way you're only going to be looking at people who have said they're willing to do it and have the availability.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
So if I were to give you suggested names, it would be generic names of a position. For example, a member of the HR department at the University of Arizona selected by the department head. Is that okay?
Yeah, so
I wouldn't give you a name, I would give you,
if you did that, then I think what we would do is we would contact the head of HR at U of A and say, Pima would really appreciate it if someone from your area could help with this task. Could you give me a name of someone who's willing, who you think is qualified and who's able, and maybe it is the head of HR, but maybe it's someone in their department. Was that kind of mirror what you're thinking?
yes.
Yeah, if you can resend me that list, I'll get you names next week as quickly as I can.
Okay, that'd be great, thank you.
Do we need another motion?
Nope, I'm just gonna do that and send you a list.
Thank you. Last item on our discussion list, 2.5, Governing Board Advisory Committees, Finance and Audit, Human Resources, and Enrollment and External Relations. So I guess the discussion here was, there was a comment earlier that we should not be on some of these committees or not have these committees.
That would be me. It would be helpful for me, for the sake of this conversation, to have somebody give me a little historical perspective on how these committees came about and why.
Jeff is going to share that historical information.
Can supplement this. The board has had a finance and audit committee for many, many years. That's just a standard good practice, and in particular because there are different kinds of financially related audit reports. The board members are not necessarily have an extensive background in that, so it was helpful to get local experts to help with that. And that's a generally accepted practice, and when particularly federal agencies or even state agencies to some degree, but mostly federal agencies are looking at compliance issues, and if there's a problem, one of the things they're going to ask any organization with the board is, do you have a finance and audit committee of experts who look at those reports and flag for you when there's a problem? So that's been around for a long time. It's a very well established practice. The other committees are much newer, obviously. The Human Resources Advisory Committee was an outgrowth of the probation by HLC in 2013, 2014. One of the areas of concern flagged by HLC was that there was some concern about whether essentially some concern about whether the HR department had functioned independently of higher level management in making certain decisions, concern about how complaints were were dealt with, sort of a variety of concerns related to the functioning of the HR systems at the college. So one response to that was the board created an HR advisory committee, the purpose of which was to identify and report on metrics that helped the board get a picture of how well the system was functioning, right? So not to look at individual personnel matters, but to look at system functions. So for example, turnover, how long did it take to fill positions, metrics like that. So that's kind of where that came from. Then more recently, of course, the enrollment levels at the college have been an ongoing issue of concern. And so I think it was actually Ms. Garcia, a board member, suggested, well, maybe we ought to form, to really put some focus on this issue, the board should have an advisory committee to work with the college and report to the board about undertaking appropriate initiatives to improve enrollment and reporting on effectiveness. So I'd say that's the really quick kind of where it came from. So, and also just a really quick difference between committee types. So the college has lots of different committees. They report somewhere to somewhere at Pima, right? So those committees are reporting typically to the management of a unit or some decision maker at the college. They don't report to the board, and because they report to someone at the college, they don't follow the open meeting law. They're not required to. Board advisory committees are committees where the board appoints the individuals, sets the charter, and where the primary purpose of that group is to advise the board, right? As opposed to they're not advising the chancellor or the head of HR or finance or facilities or whatever. Their primary purpose is to advise a board. Committees that meet that definition have to follow the open meeting law because of their task. So there's a different focus depending on what general category of committees we're talking about, and those are the two general categories, if that makes sense.
So, I mean, discussion-wise, I'm not on finance and audit or HR, so I can't speak to them. I mean, the Enrollment and External Relations Committee, which I'm on along with Luis, who's not here. I mean, I think it's a good group. I mean, we discuss good things, but I will say that the information shared from the college folks in those committees, or in that committee, is we see the same information in the board meetings in a distilled version, like they go into a little more depth in the committee meeting. I'm not sure that as a board member, I can say as a board member, I don't feel like my participation in that committee has added value to me. I hope having the committee has added value to the college to be able to have that input, but I would have no problem if it wasn't a board committee, quote unquote, anymore, and it just became like a committee that reported into Phil if he feels like it's useful for him to be able to receive that kind of input. Hopefully it would continue, but I in the 9 months now, I mean, we haven't met that many times, but you know, I haven't, there's nothing in there that like I feel like I didn't then get at another board meeting where we saw basically the same presentation, so it's somewhat duplicative in that sense. I don't know if that's the same for finance and audit or HR. I'm not in those committees, so I can't speak to that.
So I just want to add that the reason for for that particular committee was because the board believed that the college wasn't doing enough in enrollment, and we wanted to know the specifics about the outreach. A lot of advertisement, but no participation really out in the community. So it's kind of like, that's what we were hoping would happen.
Well, I participate, well, I've been assigned to the HR committee, and I think we've met once or twice and even haven't had a quorum, and we didn't really do any business. And I understand the reason that these committees were formed, but I'm thinking right now that the HR committee and enrollment has become a priority for this board. And we do get reports. We have it on our study session lists, and I think our involvement is more, we have a bigger emphasis by the entire board than we do assigning an individual board member to participate in this. So I'm thinking with the way we hopefully have changed the input that we receive from staff, that we can better address any concerns that we have as a group, as opposed to having individual committee meetings that, in my opinion, don't seem to be relevant.
Okay, I just want to add that, Dr. Wade, that I agree with you on the HR committee. You know, there's been a lot of issues with that, with HR, and I think that as an entire board, for us dealing with it and addressing those concerns and getting the necessary actions that we need will be in our best interest and for the college.
So I'm not on finance and audit, but I don't even know who is. But in a business world, that finance and audit committee is important for like a lot of different financial compliance reasons? Is it also important for those same reasons in this session, or could we accomplish in the board meetings the same thing that you accomplish in the committee? I genuinely don't know.
Well, I get a lot more information on the Finance and Audit Committee. It just gives me a more in-depth understanding of what's going on. So I don't have a problem with it. I think it's a great committee.
And I was going to say, I'm going to agree with that, Maria. I think that I learn a lot about the finances of the college in that committee. It's very, Dr. B does a great job. There's a lot of extra information in that we don't get at the board meeting because, like you talked about in your committee, I am the type of person that I like being on these committees because I think it gives me the opportunity to learn more about how the college is organized and running. So I would like us at least not straight away to say we're going to get rid of any of these committees, but and I'll be on another committee if no one else wants to. I don't mind doing that. That's just my thought and my suggestion.
Well, I don't know who heads up the HR committee, but if the HR committee was to continue, there needs to be more emphasis in structuring it so that people participate and actually addresses or provides the board with information that we need.
I'm wondering too, I mean, I think there was one time that the enrollment committee had a quorum issue, if I'm remembering correctly. I think we had like one of them that we had to reschedule or something. And thinking about what you were saying a minute ago, Jeff, if they weren't board committees, then quorum wouldn't matter, right? It was just whoever was there would participate, or is quorum still an issue if they're reporting in differently?
Quorum is still an issue. So if a committee does not have a quorum, it can't take an action. The difference, why it's potentially more significant when it's a board advisory committee, is then the advisory committee can't make a decision to recommend anything to the board, right? Because there's not enough committee members there to actually take that vote. It's less of an issue if they're just having a conversation with the head of a unit, for example.
So if, and just for the sake of argument, so if, let's just take the enrollment and external relations one, like if we change that from a board committee to, I don't know what it would be at that point, like Phil's committee, whatever that would be, and it's just sort of an advisory group for him to run ideas by, and then ultimately that information is fed back to us through his regular reporting anyway. It doesn't seem like they'd be taking any action, right? Because they would just be making recommendations to Phil about from external perspectives. So at that point, it would just be whoever came. I mean, you want more people to be there, obviously, but I'm just wondering if it actually could be more functional in a different structure because they could actually do something and wouldn't be held necessarily to those other roles.
There's less formality if it's a college committee versus a board committee. The other, aspect of this to think about is whether or not it's a college committee or versus a board committee. Certainly whenever there's a topic that the board is really interested in, the board can always ask the administrator for that area or the chair of the committee to come in and just share with them, this is what we've worked on this year, and report on the activities and the outcomes on some periodic basis. The difference would be they're not going to make a recommendation to the board for a board action, but the board could certainly get information about what the work of that group has been.
Well, I mean, I would be comfortable with at least, I mean, I don't know what we want to do with all these, but I would be perfectly comfortable with the enrollment and external relations being a college committee. I mean, I've been very pleased with the information Phil's been providing on the college's marketing and outreach on a pretty regular basis, and I feel like in these meetings. So again, I don't feel like I'm learning anything in those meetings that we don't then subsequently hear again in a board meeting. Like it's all kind of covered. So I don't know if there's a lot of value otherwise.
So, sorry.
We can't make a decision on this anyway tonight, right?
Yeah, because it doesn't say.
As long as what I was going to suggest is if you want to think about it, we could put an action item on, I mean, the October board meeting is not that far away. If you want to think about what you want to do with a particular committee.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I mean, we can decide in that meeting what action we take, but I think putting it on, even if we decide nothing changes, at least putting it on there gives us an opportunity to take action if we want to.
And I'm leaning towards removing HR and enrollment committees as board advisory committees and making them a college committee and then allowing any board members that want to participate to participate. That's what I think.
I would agree with that. I think as a college advisory committee, we could actually get people to, that belong to the college to participate, which is, I think, what needs to happen.
I just don't want to get accused of micromanaging if I go to those committees, if they're not board committees.
You will be.
Well, then I want to keep them as a board committee.
So then the agreement is to wait for the October board meeting to make a decision, a final decision. This will give you time to think about it. Okay? Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. That's the last item on our list of tasks we wanted to talk about today. So thank you, and I'm going to adjourn the meeting.